Hello everyone, welcome to our bonus episode for
Hello.
this week. It is listener questions time.
Is it?
Yeah, we've got some questions. We're going to answer 2 of them.
We're back for holidays. We haven't done listener questions for a while, so I thought we'd do one this week.
There's a few questions we're not going to answer, like how dare you and who do you think you are, and
Going away, not doing a podcast for 2 weeks.
how do you have a different opinion on something than I do?
Everyone was lovely.
Why do you like Stephen so much? That's self-explanatory.
No, we've got 2 listener questions that have been in our banks for a little while, and the first one is from Listener Mark. Listener Mark, who says, who are the top contenders for personality changes across the years?
Me.
How have you changed?
I started off quite nice as a child, and now I've just become bitter and twisted.
Yeah, it's true, everybody. I don't know why I fell for it. No, so Mark goes into more detail here. So he wants us to talk about personality changes, which is definitely a thing we've mentioned on and off in the podcast before, but it'll be quite interesting to get into that in a bit more depth. He also says, did you prefer them before or after the change? When exactly do you think the change happened? Well, you're over 40 now, Gemma.
Science.
Was it to do with a specific story, or was it a slow progression / natural progression? And why do you think the show decided to take the characters in the direction they went in?
This is very interesting, isn't it, this question?
I think so.
Mark.
Mark suggests Gail, Sally, and he even says Rita at times during the mid-2000s decade when they seemed to alter her a little from the more serious character she was in the 80s and 90s to a more or less full-on comedy with Norris and Emily. So there's probably, there's loads that we can talk about here. Should we have a chat about Mark's suggestions first? Gail is our obvious answer, and one that lots of people will bring up if we say, who's changed? Why isn't Corrie as good as it used to be?
Can I just say something quickly, though, about the whole general idea about personality changes? And we've definitely have had discussions on the podcast about, it feels in recent times that characters are a lot more malleable. And a lot of people will talk about, old Corrie versus new Corrie. And one of the distinctive differences, it feels to me, and there's lots of biases and not necessarily true, that it's just your perception, which may not be correct, but it does feel as though the stories are the show is based on stories rather than characters, and they don't mind changing the characters to fit the stories. I think
it happens, but not.
It's not like a massive epidemic of.
No.
Completely.
I think characters still generally
changes.
act in the way that you would expect them to. It's not often, honestly, where I look at a character who does or says something and I say, no, there's no way they'd do that. But I think if they've got a story they want to tell, then that may trump characterisation sometimes. The
biggest and most obvious one is the spider in the room. Spider.
Yes.
Personality change to fit the story. They tried to explain why he would have become an undercover policeman. And, like I said before, I was totally on board and I came up with my own theories as to why. But the reasons they gave were so weak, it just made me think that they weren't really concerned with preserving a lot of the elements of the character. And they just wanted a story based on the back... the back relationship between him and Toya.
I still got a lot of Spider from Martin's performance of him recently.
Martin Hancock knows how to play Spider more than the writers know how to write for him.
Well, is it the writers? Is it the story producers? Is it Ian at the top? I don't know where to.
Well, no, when we say writers or story, a writer, it can be many things on Coronation Street.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes the writers get a bit of flack when it's not.
The script writer is a different person to the person who produces the storylines, the person who... There are so many working parts that... I think, honestly, the calling somebody a writer on Coronation Street is so generic and vague that it doesn't really exist as a job title, does it?
I still felt he was very much Spider, and maybe it's just is it the look, is it the voice, is it whatever, but I suppose if you're giving him this job of undercover police officer, then there are definitely going to be some things that the character will do that doesn't necessarily gel with the way that they might have acted before, but I still think the way that he did things was quite spidery.
Enough has been said about Spider and the way that his character is different now, but that's just the most glaring... That's Mark says, what are your top contenders? I'm saying that.
Well, you know, we're only a couple of days into it, but we'll have to watch this space with old Henry as well if we're talking about keeping right up to date, aren't we?
Yeah.
Saw him on Monday's episode.
Subdued.
Definitely more subdued than he used to be. Still love him. Didn't seem as goofy or twittish as he had been in the past. But, you know, he did have his business hat on.
He's got business things to do.
Yeah, he had a very important business to do. Anyway, Gail, can we go back to Gail? Because
this is Mark's suggestion,
yeah,
Gail, Sally and Rita.
Yeah, I mean, that really is a night and day. I think if you were to show, like, clips of Spider now, clips of Spider in the late 90s, you go,
fair.
yeah, they look kind of the same. But Gail really is.
You don't mean look the same.
No, they seem to be portraying the same character. They're acting the same way. But Gail is so night and day. Especially, you know, on Classic at the moment, we're just coming out of the other side of the Richard Hillman saga, and she's dealing with the situation so well. She's had her whole world blown apart. She's got the kids that she has to think about. And then everybody's getting at her. Vera and Jack, or Vera really is accusing her of being in on it, and Gail is staying strong, and that very much ties in with how her character had been portrayed up until that point. I don't remember too much about what she was like when she first came into it in the 70s. I mean, she was more of a kind of a flighty teenager, wasn't she? But I think once she was with Brian and once she became a mum, she definitely was a lot more responsible and with it than she is now, I suppose. And I don't really know when the change did happen. Has she always been like that since the podcast has been on? I don't really know. as Mavis might say.
I would say I don't. You know, because she was a cleaner for a little bit, and I think that began her. I think once they started having her say, "I'm going to do a good old bottoming around here," it's like, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, maybe it was that push down the stairs that David gave her. Because even when David was being tear-away troubled teen, and that was the mid to early 2000s, I think Gail was, you know, she was able to push back on him a little bit, but maybe that was it. Maybe it's David that's worn her down, and because he's maybe the character is. We're supposed to be sympathising with David. We're supposed to be finding him funny because he's so dry and sarcastic. Then having somebody who's, you know, an easy target for David is easier to write, maybe. So so when David's going, "Oh, Gail, you bloody idiot," then it's easier for us as the audience to go, "Yeah, look at Gail," if she is acting like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I'm thinking, you know, possibly recently, and it maybe is just related to the storyline with Sarah Louise and her miscarriage and the affair and everything, she has been a bit more, or a bit less of a chocolate teapot.
I agree with you.
She is. She doesn't have that stern, hard exterior.
Do you think that it was just this series of husbands dying or being killed, or?
Well, that's the other thing that's maybe made her into a bit of a figure of fun. It's like, oh no, Gail, not again. You lost another husband, and there's just lots of things like that I think have combined that have made the character a bit more comedic and maybe less realistic. I mean, yeah, people do go through husbands in real life, but maybe that became part of the joke. You know, how many times has Gail got married? And then, you know, you could possibly say the same thing about Steve. The fact that it's like, oh, there he goes to go down the aisle again. Isn't he useless at holding on to women? Ergo, isn't he useless at everything? Because he's seen a very, very similar deterioration in characterisation, the same as Gail has, I would say.
You're saying deterioration, but you...
In my opinion, some people might prefer the new Gail.
Well...
Got the current iteration.
There are different things to consider because some characters change personality because the circumstances demand it of them, and other people change because there's just no room in the story for that many of the same character. You know, how many mums with a core of steel do we really need on Coronation Street? We don't really need Gail to be that person anymore because her family's moved on. Thinking about somebody like Carla, she kind of has turned from a sort of no nonsense, predatory, snappy, cold-hearted businesswoman into someone who's a bit more chilled out and a bit more maternal even. And that was driven by story because of what she went through with the factory roof and Aidan and Rana and everything and her mental breakdown. It's
Frank,
all completely logical.
Tony.
And it came from a story place, but at the same time, is she as fun to watch now? She has die-hard fans who love her no matter what, but I think a lot of people would agree that Carla is not, the top dog of Coronation Street anymore, like she was in her early sort of high years. That's what I would say. And you can't betray the reality of what people are going through. And that's one of the things about Coronation Street that's tricky now, because they're trying to be more realistic and they're trying to balance issues-based storylines with sensationalised things. You're just going to end up with a street full of people with PTSD. Not everybody can sort of react in a realistic way. And when they do, you get people like us complaining, oh, Carla's boring now. And it's not really fair to people in real life who've gone through it. But at the same time, it is still a fictional world. And at the end of the day, I'm not going to say the main aim is to entertain everybody, because actually the main aim is to sell advertising space and to make money for ITV. But do you do that by having a character like Carla who has transformed into, some would say, a shadow of her former self?
There is, with Carla and Gail and everybody, there is the fact that people do change as they get older, and who could say that they are the same as they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. Looking at Gail, how old's now? Audrey's 83 now. She just gone. She had Gail quite young. So Gail's what, late 60s, 70 or so? She's of an age where she's not going to be firing on all cylinders as much as she was in the quote-unquote golden era 30 years ago.
All great stories about people have a transformation in the story, don't they? You start off somewhere and you start off with one personality and you end up somewhere else. You learn something along the way, and at the end of it you're transformed in some way and you become hopefully a better person. This isn't a story about individual characters though, is it? So we don't expect the same sort of progression from these fictional characters as you might do if you're reading, Harry Potter, for example. You take a small frightened child and you end up with like the best wizard in the universe at the very end who's killed all the evil ones and saved humanity forever. You don't need that from Gail Platt.
No, but it'd be good to see.
It would be quite interesting to see what would happen.
I'd go to see the West End stage show of that. It sounds
more
realistic than The Cursed Child, doesn't it? I will also compare Gail to Deirdre's trajectory as well. Obviously, it's tragic what happened to Anne Kirkbride, and the fact that the actress and the character were taken away from her so suddenly and unexpectedly. But people, and I don't know whether people still remember this, but in the final few years of Deirdre, the same complaints that are being levelled against Gail were also, being put to Deirdre as well. And they were saying, she's just become a figure of fun now.
It's a bit of a dimwit.
Yeah, exactly. She's just been a bit thick. And whereas if you look at Deirdre in the 80s, when she was doing the whole affair saga, having to bring up Tracy on her own, then the 90s, the early 90s particularly, having Ken constantly going at her, and she was a counsellor and everything. She was stern and hard and cold then, and there was an element of comedy about her, but in her final years, they lent into that a little bit more. It certainly didn't go to the same place, same levels as it has done for Gail now. But I do wonder if we still had Deirdre, would be saying the same about her as we are about Gail now. I don't know.
Well, I think a lot of what happened with Deirdre was a juxtaposition of the two characters of Ken and Deirdre.
Yeah.
You're saying the same thing about Gail versus David, though, in a way.
Yeah, I suppose maybe in the same way that David wore down Gail, Tracy wore down Deirdre once she reappeared back on the street again. And although although young Tracy was a bit of a tearaway, the 2002 onwards Tracy was a lot more to deal with, wasn't she? I mean, Deirdre had to deal with, the confession that, I'd actually bumped off Charlie Stubbs on purpose, actually, and I know one might say that that's led her to what she became in the end. But I understand, I didn't mind Deirdre too much in the final years, but there were definitely people that were saying that she had changed. Of course, not all changes are for the worse. Look at Sally. I love Sally Webster. Sorry, Metcalf. I still haven't got used to it. I love Sally Metcalf at the moment, and I would say that among the classic cast, the golden cast, whatever you call it, the long-term cast members, Sally is definitely up there with the most universally loved and popular ones. She's nothing like how she was up until 96, 97, is she?
No, she was a bit prissy and boring, I would have called her.
Yeah, I mean...
She's very nondescript.
In the early 90s, she was just mum, wasn't she? To Rosie and Sophie, she was very mummy-ish, and she'd be there with a denim kind of... jackets. And
dishing out baked beans and fish fingers. Or cornflakes, depending on what time of day it was. And
she just kind of went along with anything, and her and Kevin were very happy together. And then when Brian Part, the producer, came along and said... Who's the couple that I can blow apart? Who's maybe a little bit boring? Their relationship was put up for explosion, but it wasn't necessarily that changed Sally. Although we definitely got to see. Maybe there are like 3 stages to Sally. There was the early kind of carefree, fun, then mumsy-ish Sally. Then you got during the Natalie Horrocks saga, she became a lot harder, didn't she? And when she was writing whore on Natalie's mirror, and then she went through kind of the stage where she went out with Greg Kelly, and she was more kind of firm and business minded, and I didn't particularly like that Sally. But whereas you could say that David maybe has changed Gail for the worse, Rosie changed Sally's character for the better, because it was out of Rosie's education, I think, and Sally wanting her to go to Oak Hill. That's where Snobby Sally came from, and Snobby Sally is still what we've got today, and she's been running with this personality for 15 years now, and it's so there was no trace of that really in the early days, was there?
No.
But what's the first word you think of when you think of Sally now? It's snob.
Yep.
But she's hilarious, and that comedy is still working time after time after time. Yes, they're making her out to be a bit stupid with some of the things that she says, but it's not the same level as you get with some of the other characters, like, the Kirks or anything. It's she doesn't realise the things that she's saying, and that people are laughing at her a little bit.
But in a sense, that character, the transformation from her, into a snob, that came around in a time when a lot of the old guard were being removed from the show, and so the people that might have had that, what was Mavis's? Derek was more that he was a snob. He looked down on everybody, and he was comedic, and his antics were like comedic, weren't they?
Yes.
And
Percy Sugden in a way as well. I suppose.
You can't make a direct comparison or parallel between Sally's character and those 2 characters, but you certainly can say there was a vacuum left when Brian Park got rid of lots of these older characters, and so established characters had to fill the gaps, or they had to introduce new characters that would fill these kind of archetypes. And the archetypes are different, and they have different manifestations depending on the character themselves and also the period of time in which they are portrayed. So Sally was kind of like carrying on the torch from these older characters, and so it necessitated her transforming.
You still had Norris throughout all this time though as well, who's also one to look down on other people, and Sally's snobbish period came a while after Brian Park came in. But you're right, she did fill the gap in a way, but I think
I'm
that
not
they
saying
just
like it was like a direct, bomb, all this happened.
I'd be really interested to know, like, with the development of Sally, was it always planned for her to be a snob and to stick with it? Or was it just like, there's a story, she's going to try and get Rosie into private school, let's have her be a bit of a pushy mum. And then they saw something in the character, in Sally Whittaker, she was then's portrayal of it, and go, this is actually brilliant, let's run with that. And they've been able to keep that going pretty consistently ever since. Then of course you got the introduction of Tim, and all of a sudden they become one of Coronation Street's golden couples, because they kind of are filling the role of the a bit like the Stan and Hilda kind of the layabout guy and the woman who wants to better herself, and is always henpecking him and everything, and that's in many ways what Corrie is about when it comes to couples. So that's been a brilliant change, and long may that continue.
Sometimes a character changes when the introduction of the character is over and the writers, or whatever you want to say a writer is, get to know the actor, and the actor slots better into the role that they... like Abby's one of the best examples. She came in as an absolute scumbag, and she's gone through lots of hardships, and now she's one of, the sort of... If you were to say, who's a really loyal, reliable, good person on the street, you would say Abby. But, even like a couple of years ago, no way.
Yeah. Some characters absolutely come in and because they're being written for so many different writers, and you can go months and months before the same writer gets to write for a new character more than once.
Yep.
So they're given this sheet about this is what the character is like. But you're right, it can take a while to see what works well with them, and for the writers to get an understanding of what makes them tick.
And I don't want to say anything about what the background, how everything works and things, but I'm not speaking from a position of knowing or having authority over knowing this, but I'm sure that some of the writers haven't met, especially new characters.
Oh yeah,
they're writing for people they haven't met. They don't know what the performance is going to be like. That's why it can take a year sometimes to really groove into who is this person, and how are we going to write this character in a unique and compelling way. Unfortunately, because the cast is so huge, I think a lot of the more individual voices on the show are becoming muddled and lost.
One of the ones that's just popped into my head, talking about taking a while to settle into the character and seeing what works for them, is Ryan, with Ryan Prescott's portrayal of him, because he's obviously, you could talk about recasts making the character different for ages. I mean, that's just the way it is. But I think when Ryan Connor, as he is now, or at least was, I suppose, up until the acid attack thing, was a lot more of a funny character, wasn't he? And a bit more of a doofus, goofy character. But I think I've in my memory when Ryan Prescott was first cast, he wasn't so much like that, and he was a bit more serious. And yes, he was a bit useless and still hooked on drugs and everything. But I don't think they gave him quite the same comedy as they do now. Some
characters have a lot of depth, and it's difficult to start out with that depth, isn't it? And every time they recast a character, they do sort of start again almost.
Yeah, I mean, which is fine. Like, Nick, nothing like the Adam Rickett Nick.
But it can be upsetting when you're really invested in a character and the way it was portrayed by a particular actor.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And
I'm sure there were lots of people who loved the floppy fringed Adam Rickett.
Yeah.
And that were disappointed when Ben Price came along and is like, this isn't the Nick that I know. But the new Nick, if we can still call him that, has many great qualities. Adam Hussein, brilliant recasting. Nothing like how Zenon Ditcher portrayed him. He's suddenly got a personality now.
Well, a lot of that is what was the purpose of the character, and sometimes when they want to reinvigorate a child character, they'll just recast.
Yeah, but I don't usually mind too much if they change a character when they're recasting. I think I used to mind more, but it is what it is now. And it doesn't happen very often, and more often than not, it has been successful. the Todd is great now, and I was very anti recasting of Todd when they got rid of Bruno Langley, but actually Gareth Pierce he's not the same as old Todd, but I still like him.
No, it's like a parallel universe version of Todd. I think that Gareth Pierce is fantastic. I love the way he plays Todd. I like Todd as he is now. I was devastated when everything happened with Todd to get rid of the character. We're not going to go into that.
No.
You know, it's obviously...
sensitive subject
don't
matter.
we? We know what I'm talking about. But some things you got to let go of, don't you? And Gareth Pierce is just fantastic. I'm so glad he's on the show.
I'd rather have Gareth Pierce playing Todd than there being no Todd at all.
Yeah.
It gives
but I think,
something to
you
do,
know,
at least.
and I don't think it's fair to compare
No.
at all. So
Well,
I'm not going to.
let's go back to Mark's original email. He had one other suggestion, which was Rita, saying a little bit more serious back in the mid to early 2000s, and has since become more comedic. I don't know whether I noticed that one quite so much. She is obviously now a lot different to how she was in her heyday. You know, Rita and Mavis at the cabin, completely different character. You often talk about what a bitch Rita was when she was basically bullying Mavis.
And poor Mavis couldn't go to the HR department because it was Rita.
But she similar to Gail, she seemed a lot more switched on then than she is now. Again, you know, look, she's an old lady now. They still use her for the odd comedic line every now and then. She's much more of a kind of granny-ish, cosy, says a bit of a saucy line every now and then kind of thing. I'm not expecting her to be the same Rita as she was back then. Was she full on comedy with Norris and Emily? I don't know. I think that she still played a good straight man to Norris in the same way that she did to Mavis's Witterings, and she was just as despairing of him as she was for her. I think. I don't know. See what anyone else thinks about that. When we put this on our Patreon earlier this week to say we would be discussing character changes today, we got an email from Lisa who wanted to chip in. And she also suggested Gail as one of hers, but a couple of others that she's mentioned. Firstly, Anna Windass, who she says is so unbelievably different early on from the later version of her. At the beginning, she's always drunk, enabling Eddie, or crying over Gary. It's a jarring change to a family matriarch I remember from later years. I'm pretty sure you won't talk about her because she's not there anymore, but wow, what a change. Well, we'll talk about her now as you asked us, Lisa. Yes, Anna Windass definitely did change.
The whole Windass family.
Yeah, that was let's have them come in with a I mean, it's similar to the Battersbys. Often when the character comes, a family comes in to make a statement, and then we have to keep them in. They'll soften them, won't they?
Only Eddie escaped unscathed because he left relatively early before he was rehabilitated.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, he was still a layabout, but he wasn't as obnoxious in his later years.
He never really changed that much. He was
not
still
too much.
A bit of a rough and tumble kind of a guy.
Yeah, I mean, they had him baking cakes to soften him a bit, but he was still a scrounger. Whereas Anna, you're right, in her first appearance, I think her first appearance was her in the kitchen with Eddie at their old house when Joe McIntyre and David were trying to get them to pay for a kitchen they'd fitted, and Anna was just as much as Eddie trying to pull a fast one and scam them and say, no, this place has fallen to bits, we're not paying for it. And then when the Windasses then moved onto the street, weeks, months later, I can't remember how long it was, they were still a very, very antagonistic family. I don't know what it was, because it's been so long ago since I've watched that string of episodes. I don't know what it was that made Anna soften. Because by the time we did our original character profile of her, which, I don't know when that was, 2012, 2013, I'm going to say, our impression of her was that she was a little bit boring, a little bit just mumsy-ish, just a bit nice.
Yeah,
I mean, she'd adopted Faye by that point. Eddie had gone. She was going out with Owen, I think. And yeah, maybe it was the introduction partly of Faye that did cause that personality change, but I think it is also the fact that Coronation Street didn't want there to be another really rough and obnoxious family on the street that would get people's backs up, but that Anna as well also went through another change in her later years, because I wouldn't describe her as boring or matronly or mumsy-ish or dull in her final years, but that change that she went through when she was a lot harder and harsher, and not in the same way as she was when she came in, but she was a lot more shrieky, Harridan-ish, char-grilled fishwife-like, as Pat Phelan might say, was due to his character, Pat's character, wasn't it? Because he got under her skin so much. He obviously raped her. He wound her up over Gary. He almost made her revert back to how she had been, but just channeling that rage at him rather than anybody that was trying to get in her way. Lisa was also mentioned Tracy. We haven't talked about Tracy's personality change yet, have we?
Nope.
Have you noticed a change here? Lisa says that she's just a sassy flower shop owner instead of the horrible Tracy of the early 2000s.
A lot of people have said this. A lot of people don't forgive Tracy for getting away with killing Charlie because, the background of the story is that she faked domestic abuse, clonked Charlie on the head, said that he came after her, and then she tried to get Deirdre to lie, ended up in prison and got let out early because the evidence wasn't collected correctly, and the guy, one of the forensic people, was a crook. So she although she went to prison for it, she certainly didn't serve her full time, and she got up to some really evil stuff. It wasn't just murdering Charlie. She also made Roy and Hayley think that Roy had fathered Amy, who was called Patience, when she was a baby. She was really, really
we're just on
person.
classic Coronation Street now, getting to the Wally Bannister storyline where Blanche starts dating Bernard Cribbins, and then eventually Tracy ends up dating him, this 70-odd-year-old guy. So she was definitely she was a lot more evil and kind of smiling and seductress-y femme fatale back in those days. Was it motherhood that changed her? Was it just that certain behaviours feel more natural coming out of a younger person, someone who hasn't learned enough about life? Maybe
there's definitely this element of look at this sexy, horrible cow. There's a lot of women on Coronation Street who were very sexy and very vile.
Tanya Pooley, for example.
In a predatory kind of way that feels kind of misogynistic in hindsight. But Tracy's definitely mellowed quite a lot. I don't like the idea of her being interchangeable with any other woman on the street. I'd rather that she kept this core of... It's kind of like Blanche's attitude of, say, plain speaking, but she's got a malicious twist to it. I liked the way it came out on Sarah when Adam took refuge at number 1 after they split up, and Tracy was having to go at her at the doorstep. That was the first time we'd seen Tracy unload since she tried to have a go at Aaron about what happened with him and Amy. So there's still elements of that kind of real, ferocious side of Tracy. But I agree. She's you're right. She is just sassy now rather than being vindictive, which is what I like that sort of character on the street.
I think that motherhood is important to her, and she doesn't want to set a bad example to Amy as much these days. Also, maybe she has learnt a lesson because, she was sent to prison with her scheming before, probably doesn't want to end up there again. And she's also had things like accidentally setting Victoria Court on fire that would kind of make anybody think their actions again before they take out petty revenge. But you also had that story with her versus Carla that seemed to run for blimmin' ages about 6-7 years ago, didn't you? Everyone was sick of Carla and Tracy always at each other's throats. So I think that possibly the powers that be have mellowed her out a little bit to try and because they recognised that people were getting a little bit bored of Tracy acting in that way and
I don't
plotting.
know why you would say that. I think that what did you just say? How did it come to
the Carla and Tracy?
Yeah, the Carla and Tracy feud was really I think it was a downfall of both those characters.
It feels like after that it came to a head and they were on the side of the cliff and everything, and then they went to there was something about them in a hotel. I don't remember.
I don't remember
the details, and Carla didn't let Tracy have her kidney medicine. I don't know what it was, but eventually they kind of came to an understanding, didn't they? Maybe it was around Carla and Nick's wedding, and when Tracy got locked up by Jenny in the supply cover. I don't know, but yeah, it felt like after that the writers were like, okay, we're going to move away from those characters completely for a while. You said you've seen too much of them. And then when they came back to the fore, they just didn't have quite the fire that they had. That
could have been, a feud for the ages. That really could have been something quite incredible and, iconic. But it just made both Tracy and Carla look pathetic. Really, honestly. I found it didn't work for me. Mm-hmm. So those are two good examples of characters that have changed. Yeah. And you've kind of selected some more that you think...
I've thought of a few. I would say, on the subject of Tracy, and yes, being a mum and a family woman now that she has matured her a little bit, she is also having to deal with being married to silly Steve, and the changing personality from Steve McDonald in the early days to now is... It's almost the same golf as Gale, to be honest. When he came into the show in the late 80s and then running through the early 90s, he was cool. All the girls fancied him. He was very slick. He was, not the brightest in school, but he knew how to get what he wanted in other ways. He got all the girls. Then he went through the whole marriage to Vicky. Then he was a businessman. He early on did his t-shirt printing business after he dropped out of school. He had his gambling phase, and he was there was a storyline that ran for a few weeks, month or so, in the mid to late 90s, where he was always gambling and winning and getting really, really cocky about it. And I can't picture the current Steve doing anything like that. He was so smart, and yes, he it was a bit of a case of pride came before a fall in the end. He ended up going to prison after receiving stolen goods. He was just very, 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 very different to how he is now, because he's just been infantilized, hasn't he? He's just used as a comic relief. And yes, he was funny in the early days, but it was almost like we were laughing with him, and now he's used as a character to laugh at him.
Steve is basically the embodiment of all the dumb husbands / fathers in adverts.
Yeah.
The stupid man who doesn't know which way the mop goes on the floor, who has to use the secret power of Flash to clean his kitchen because his wife left him, or you know what I mean? All these dumb men on TV, which is really unfortunate and annoying.
He's just under Tracy's thumb now. It's a bit of a
stereotype of useless men.
Yeah, he's a useless man. He's a useless dad. He's still got the business. He's still got... Yeah, he's still in charge of streetcars, isn't he? I think. But, I wouldn't trust him to run anything. I don't know. I'm wondering... I think that really started with Michelle, because even when the podcast started, and this was the first time that I'd ever properly done serious joining of Corrie fan communities, going onto the Coronation Street blog, looking onto forums and everything, Steve McDonald was a front runner easily for favourite character. everybody loved Steve. He'd come top in character polls. He was the favourite guy on the street.
He was like the main male character.
He was the main guy in Coronation Street. And you're still seeing this in classic Coronation Street in the early 2000s at the moment. But something has happened in the last 10 years, and I can't exactly put my finger on it, other than to say I think Michelle has got a lot to do with it when she just downgraded his character by dragging him through the mud, making fun of him, teaming up with Liz against him, and Coronation Street writers just made him the henpecked husband, and he's not come out of that phase. Now he's the embarrassing dad phase to Tracy, and it's just really, really not working. But I think Simon Gregson seems to enjoy playing him like this. And I've seen Simon do a few interviews and things, and he plays up to the character that Steve has become, but it's so worlds away from how it used to be.
But do we need what Steve was, or do we need who Steve is now?
I don't think we need as many comic relief characters like this. He's, how old is he now? 50? Coming up to 50? And I think that as somebody, as a later middle-aged man, he should be, at the top of his game, able to lead these really kind of serious stories about everyday life. And I don't know whether I could trust putting Steve at the front of a big story again. He had, I think the last serious story that he had was the Ollie death story, and he actually did do a really, really good job of that, didn't he?
Yeah.
They kind of pulled him out of his comic phase, obviously very appropriately for that, but he's just gone back to it again. And there was a strange intermediate phase in between where he was doing his fun running to try and raise money for Ollie, and then just the silly Steve started coming out again. So I don't know, maybe I'm going back on what I said, maybe if they wanted to give him a serious story they could. I think he might have done alright in his depression story, but I definitely put his part of his character change down to Michelle, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I don't know, what Simon Gregson actually thinks about it, but I'm getting the impression that he doesn't mind or doesn't notice.
Well, a lot of people would not, would say they like Steve as he is. So
a lot of people would, but definitely if you compare back to 11 years ago when the podcast started and everybody loved Steve, and you're right, he was the main character. He was still Gurney, but he could still carry major storylines easily. I don't think it's the same now. And weirdly, what's happened to him has also happened to Dev, but it's working so well for Dev, isn't it?
Oh, well, I like Dev, and we all like Dev. There's a few people that find him ridiculous, but that's going to happen when he is playing, a bit of a caricature. But the thing about Jimmy Harkishin is that I truly think that he has a gift for turning dark in a scene and becoming very serious and very commanding, and there's still that streak of authority he's got, and it's come with age too.
And he can do it without doing
he
that.
And he doesn't compromise the other parts of Dev too. I feel like Dev's a whole person, and I don't feel like when he's being serious that it invalidates his goofy side. I've got a lot of time for Dev. I think he is one of Corrie's most underrated characters.
He is at the moment, but I definitely don't think he used to be one of my favourites. When he came into the show, he was definitely, it's quite funny because he was the suave ladies man that actually would get all the girls. They were falling at his feet, weren't they?
Yep.
But now it's just like, the aging swinger sort of story. He thinks he still is that guy in a way, but he's just he's not. He's past it a bit, and he's had to, he would say lower his standards to date Bernie, but actually they've got a quite nice relationship going on there.
I think it shows a bit of maturity for Dev too, that he's not focused on looks, and he is also not hung up on the things that make him and Bernie different, as long as they enjoy each other's company and make each other happy. And that is definitely completely different to what Dev would have been like when he was younger. He was just out for as many sexy ladies as he could.
And he also had his eyes on the business as well, which he still does. But I don't necessarily enjoy business storylines. I find them usually a bit dry. Dev was more into that kind of boring, dry business storyline. And now he's still into the business, but in a funny way, Mm-hmm. So I you're right. I think that character has naturally evolved into becoming someone who's much, much better than he used to be, in my opinion.
It was a one note, slick businessman and womanizing businessman. It was kind of a bit like Mike, in a way. That if you had left him in the show and you kept him on that pathway, he didn't cut as many corners as Mike did. That Mike's business story was always, how can I scam and cadge my way into this and that.
Yeah, whereas Mike didn't change. Mike in 2006, whenever it was that he died, was the Mike of 1974. Was it when he came in? I don't remember. That's
very true.
And they could have stuck with that for Jimmy's character, but they didn't. And partly is going through that embarrassing dad phase, which now that Ardy and Asha are old enough to be embarrassed by him, Mike didn't have that. No, I suppose he could have been embarrassing dad to Adam, I suppose. But so that's the character change that's absolutely brilliant for me.
What would you say about Ken? Do you think Ken's changed in his life? I think there are times when Ken's been more intense than he is now. I think he's mellowed a bit.
He wants a quieter life now. That's understandable with age.
I don't think he's really changed. I think the only thing you could say is age has done as you would have expected. When he was younger, he was more idealistic and a bit more adventurous. Now he's not. Now he's a bit more. It feels as though he's a bit more open-minded than he was when he was younger. He's definitely not as snobbish as he used to be.
He's not as snobbish as he used to be, but they still do use that for fun every now and then. Like when he was like rolling his eyes at the Americanisms last week. That was classic Ken. And also he still does have his womanizing side. We just saw with the Martha story last year.
It's nice
when he was like being an old horn dog with her, wasn't he? That was brilliant.
I like the idea that Ken has never learned anything. Even though he has, but I like to besmirch his character and pretend that the whole thing is just Ken never learning a lesson. But
he doesn't have as many. He was very outspoken with his views, and he'd get into rows with people and fights and everything in the days, and he was idealistic, wasn't he? And he was ran his mouth a bit. Yeah, he absolutely would, and I can't see him doing that as much these days. But I think he still could, and if he was in a situation where he needed to have a good old shout about something, he would. So
I know it's not that. It's fading into not being as recent as we probably think it was, but the whole Who Pushed Ken story, he had to take the reins there, didn't he, and go, stop arguing, we're not having this anymore, brush it under the carpet, no more, that's it, Barlows unite.
Yeah.
Because everyone was fighting about who it was that pushed him, and he was like, it doesn't matter, at the end of the day, everyone shut up. Yeah. He got really cross, I think, I remember.
Yeah, and it was also during the after the story when Peter pushed Billy off the cliff, and I think Ken was instrumental in all the Barlows closing ranks there, wasn't he?
Yeah, we've got to look out for ourselves here. We got to...
Yeah, so I think he's very much how I would expect and wants that character to evolve over the 60 years, which
There's
is fantastic.
Definitely a difference between evolving a character and changing a character.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Some of them are a lot more natural. Who else are we? Some other notes that I've got down there, like Beth, for example. That's an easy one to throw out there as being a change for the worse. She's just kind of bitter now, isn't she? Whereas before, when she first came in, people were saying, "Oh, she's just another Janice Siller kind of character," but she wasn't. She was a lot nicer and mumsy and caring towards Craig, but it's just kind of worn away into she's the person that screws up her nose and moans these days, which is a real shame. Who else? Gary, you talked about the Windasses earlier, but we kind of didn't mention him, and you've enjoyed the change that he's been through recently, haven't you?
Oh, I remember having conversations and saying I didn't like Gary, so I thought he was a pointless character. He's changed a lot. He was very much a scoundrel.
He was a real nasty guy when he
and
first
they
came
sent
in,
him
wasn't he?
to
As a
war.
proper chav.
He came back with PTSD and I think he's a bit of a chameleon, although there definitely is a core element to his character of he always thinks he's doing the right thing. Since he, not in his very early days when he was, very chavvy and a bit of a criminal, but I think he does. I think he thinks he does everything from a moral standpoint, even when we can't see that. That doesn't seem to make sense to us, but. But yeah, he does change according to whatever the story's supposed to be, and I really think that I'm going to say something. Maybe this is controversial, but when Gary got away with killing Rick, I think that was the beginning of Coronation Street starting to disregard consequences and brush them under the carpet for characters, because that should have had consequences for Gary. I don't care whether you say that it was self-defense. He never got caught for that. Nobody knows he did it.
They kind of say now, everything that happened with Laura dying and Kelly knows the truth now. There have been some kind of consequences,
and she accepted it because she's the daughter.
Got away with it.
Then because she forgave him, then it doesn't count. But I genuinely think that lack of, because Coronation Street always used to sort of pride itself on punishing the bad guys, and bad guys always got, bad deeds were never rewarded. But at the moment, I think Corrie's lost sight of that a little bit, and that was the beginning for me.
I don't mind him as he is now.
I know you don't. I like Gary. I think Gary's gone up in my estimation.
I go through phases with Gary.
I'm glad he didn't get in trouble for it. I'm not saying anything about what I wish happened. I'm just stating that Corrie used to always be the bad guys always got their just desserts, and Gary was a bad guy in that story. He was a loan shark and he was a murderer.
Yeah. A couple of other small ones before we move on, because this is running quite long. It's a great.
I think this should just be the only question, but we got another one.
But if you look at Roy's first scenes back in 95, 96, was it? Seemed like a very different character. He was more just sort of an annoying neighbour back then when he was he shared a block of flats with Deirdre, and he was very smiley, wasn't he? He was friendly. He was social. He got on Deirdre's wick by badgering her with his obsessiveness and wanting to help and everything. And although he's obviously still got elements of that with his specific interests, he's a lot. He doesn't really smile much these days, does he? He's kind of gone into the. What's that Martian called? The depressed android from Hitchhiker's Guide. Marvin, yeah.
It's not like Marvin.
Well, he's a bit more...
He's very reserved.
Yeah, much more than he was. And I don't know whether there was a particular plot reason for that, because, it wasn't long after that he started dating Hayley, and maybe that's when he got a bit more awkward and nerdy. But there's no natural reason, I think, why his personality would change quite so much. I think he was more into like the paranormal and things back then. These days, these days he would say it was utterly ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Maria, again, big difference to how she was when she first came in. She was very much a female Tyrone, wasn't she? She didn't have any of the glamour that she has these days. She was the kennel attendant. She was kind of fun. She was just nice girl next door type. But they literally took her to Audrey's one day and gave her a makeover, and it almost was they changed her personality at the same time, because she has become that sassier, sexier personality since then. And I think I do prefer the older Maria, but a bit like Gary, I have warmed up to current Maria a lot more in recent years. They're the main ones.
There are lots of examples.
There's loads
we
more.
could talk about this for a long time.
Yeah,
because there are loads of people that we haven't mentioned.
Couple of oldies. Raquel obviously went through a big change in her final years, and that disappointed me when she went off to her acupuncture course, or no, what was it, aromatherapy, and she came back much more serious and sensible and mature and confident. I didn't really enjoy that, although it did then lead to that lovely comeback a few years later. Ivy Brennan, very different when she first came in. She was a lot more of a party girl, wasn't she? And I think they just didn't really, the writers hadn't settled on what they wanted her to be, because obviously she then went into being the Harridan, very Catholic mother-in-law from hell sort of character, which there's really nothing of in her original appearance. Fred, I think, was a lot more predatory in his early days when he was going after Audrey. Don was a lot nicer and kinder, but in his final years, and maybe this is through being married to Ivy, he'd become a lot more bitter. But I really enjoyed Don's final few years, and I know not everybody did. So that to me was a change for the better. Molly Dobbs changed, probably for the worse. She was a bit like Maria, a nice girl next door type, but then she had that affair with Kevin, and that really was, I think, a case of plot driving character change. And just the last one, I think, Bet, a proper classic character who changed, but that was, like you said, there's more of a difference between change and evolution, and I think that it was brilliant watching her going from the late 60s, early 70s, good time girl, dizzy barmaid, to the confident, no nonsense landlady that we got in the late 80s, early 90s. She was very, very different character, but she really came into her own, matured, and I would say there's definitely a parallel there between her and Jenny. You know, Jenny was a sort of a willful teen when she was originally in the show, when she was Rita's foster child, and then she ran off, didn't she? She sort of went away, came back in the show, and ended up with kidnapping children. Came back again in her current state, and she's gone from cleaner in the factory to landlady of the Rovers. She's had to become more mature with it. She's
still got that streak to her, but again, just like Bet, it all feels incredibly well portrayed. It feels natural. It feels like a progression rather than a regression, which some of these other characters, you can definitely describe their characters changing in that way. I'm really happy with how her character's gone.
I am. I think that Bet's level of maturity and toughness, and this isn't a smile, it's a lid on a scream, we don't see quite as much with Jenny, but I don't particularly mind about it. Like, Jenny isn't afraid to show weakness or kind of have a lip wobble in front of the punters, whereas I don't think Bet would have done that.
Jenny's more vulnerable because she's got a bigger support system than Bet ever did. Bet was by herself from the very beginning. With the first time when we first saw the character, she had mates. She didn't have friends. She didn't have family. She had, she was on her own, and she forced her way into every situation that she put her foot through the door and she pushed herself. And Jenny was kind of led. Johnny's responsible for her position at the Rovers. Not to say that the character doesn't deserve to be where she is, because she definitely does. And it's nice that she's got the support system because it gives depth to her character. But you can't directly compare the two of them at all, can you?
No.
Because they're completely different types of people. And I like that. That's what Coronation Street should be. It should be there should be a symbiosis of the actors and the writers creating characters together. And sometimes I feel like one or the other becomes complacent, and becomes a stagnation, and that's also not a good thing. For all we say about characters changing, and maybe it's a bad thing sometimes, it's much better to see a character evolve than stagnate.
Yeah.
And some of these characters are definitely just circling the drain.
Well, then we've got quite a good discussion out of that first question. Thank you very much,
Definitely
Mike.
could have...
We could have gone on with that for ages.
We could have spoken about none of those characters and had a completely different set of characters and said almost exactly the same thing and taken another hour.
I think for me, the best example, my favourite example of a character changing for the better is Sally. She's so different now to how she... I liked early Sally. Mid Sally, when she got a bit hard and businessy, I didn't like so much, but she's come out and out and flourished, and Sally is just brilliant. She's genuinely funny now. I think she's absolutely the best. And I know we had a lot of examples of, I don't like the character as much these days, but there's just as many examples of characters that have changed for the better. But yes, Sally is up there for me, I think.
Good one.
Oh, and I'm going to Emily as well. Also pretty good. Didn't even mention her. She's quite different to how she was. She was quite different to how she started. But no time for that now. Right, next question. Gemma, would you like to read David's question out?
David says, what storylines from the past would you like to see remade in modern day? In a similar vein to how the 2010 tram crash echoed the 1967 tram crash.
This is a nice question. I don't think we're going to be here for an hour with this one, but I love the idea of looking back into the past and saying what ideas were used then that program writers now could take and then modernify. I was having a look back at some of the stories of the 60s and 70s to give me a few ideas for this. It was actually a bit harder than I thought it would be. And I was coming across stories back then and thinking, oh, they kind of have already done earlier versions of that. Like, there was a story really early in 1960 when the characters believed that Coronation Street was going to be demolished because Ina Sharples sees a notice up at the council, at the town hall when she goes to get a gas pressure looked at. And so everyone's like, oh no, this is the end of Coronation Street. And that was definitely mirrored in the 2000 tarmacking the street, and then just recently Ray Crosby's going to tear down the street. You had the coach crash in 1969 on the way to the Lake District, and then just recently-ish, not really recently at all really, there was the minibus crash. Do you remember when Steve was driving the Underworld minibus?
Yeah, we just mentioned
that
it.
was kind of similar. You had pantomimes back in the old days. You had a pantomime 15 years ago, maybe it's time for that again, maybe not. Baby snatching they had in the early years of Coronation Street, where little Christopher Hewitt was snatched. That was then done again with Joshua Peacock in the early 2000s. Although I think they had to...
Ooh, the cat just fell over.
I think I might have just kicked the cat in the head accidentally. Sorry, Abby. I think they had to curtail that Josh Peacock kidnapping because it happened around the same time as the Madeleine McCann case.
Yes.
Was coming out. So I don't know.
Was coming out.
Was in the news.
Yes.
So I don't know. Could there be an opportunity for a baby snatch again? Maybe.
It was a bit of a mini baby snatch when Johnny stole his grandchild.
Oh yes, I've forgotten about that one. Nice. See, this is the thing I'm saying. Lots of the things that the major stories, but I suppose you'd say is there ever anything new in soap?
Well, this is
or
the
fiction
thing.
in general.
We've spoken before about this. There are certain basic human stories that repeat themselves throughout history, but there are certain things that are new. That's why it's exciting when Coronation Street starts to engage with technology, because they can tell stories in a new way.
Yeah, and I think maybe some of the issues stories that Coronation Street has maybe been criticised for tackling too many of in recent years is almost saying, well, we don't want to revisit the same wells again, but what are the new things, or what are the things that are more
what do we understand
important?
Differently?
Yeah, exactly. So you've got your mental health is such a big thing these days. So we're able to revisit that with Carla recently, but they did still have mental health stories back in the 60s. Like Florrie Lindley had a breakdown, didn't she, at some point? But it was done very differently then to how it's done now.
I want to say we've gone back and looked at. And we've watched some highlights of the last, the previous 60 odd years, whatever. And I think things were handled a lot more sensitively than I would have expected them to have been. I don't think that there were a few cases where I think Coronation Street perhaps it didn't cover themselves with glory with certain topics, But I think that they've always done big, serious storylines.
Yeah,
Well,
I've been surprised.
I don't think
as well.
I've ever looked back at something and gone, "Oh no, that was bungled really badly." The only thing you can say is that the characters sometimes portrayed questionable or unpolitically correct attitudes, but I would never want to change that because that's part of history, and you can't erase or pretend that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Like, Vera being homophobic, like everybody being racist against the travelling community that came to the street.
Yeah.
Like Steve being transphobic, for example, when he went on holiday that time.
Well, yeah, it was just kind of the embarrassment about ending up in bed.
Well, there are things, those things were part of the way that people acted and spoke, and I don't like the idea that Coronation Street censors unsavoury attitudes to save blushes, because I feel that you can't, if you want to fight something, you've got to acknowledge it exists.
Yeah.
That's all I want to say.
Yeah, so there aren't many stories, you're right, where you can say they did a real hash job of that back in the early days. Let's try it again.
There's probably some things that I would, we only saw the highlights. We didn't see really terrible things. But
I'd be you just mentioned about the travelling community, and that was a really great string of episodes that we watched, wasn't it? And when was that? Was that early 70s maybe?
I'm sure it was black and white.
Yes, you're right, it was, so it must have been before that.
Because Lucille was the character who was really engaging with them and speaking to them and going to talk to the travellers, and then you had like Len and all the rest of them going, let's go and beat them up and get them to leave us alone.
I wonder whether they'd want to
they could
touch
never do
that
story.
again,
they
because
never
it's
do
still,
it now.
there are still travelling communities around.
There are, honestly, the way that the community reacted to the travellers in that episode, if they were to do a realistic portrayal of how people would react now, they wouldn't change almost anything about it, because the exact same things would happen. But they wouldn't want to. They wouldn't want to have that.
I don't think they'd want necessarily to have the fallout on that. You
which is really unfortunate. It's honestly such a sad thing that you can't really honestly talk about some very important social, cultural things because people get too offended and upset.
Yeah. You were speaking, I think it was mostly last week on the podcast, about missing the opportunity to properly revisit the environmentalism story. And I know that's not an old Corrie story, but we're still going back 25 odd years now since Spider was holding his placards and Emily Bishop was up a tree and everything. And nowadays, because of the global warming being in the news and all that, I think it was a... You know what it's like. I think now would be a perfect opportunity, or would have been a perfect opportunity to look at that. You talked about the Just Stop Oil protesters, and they didn't want to go down that route whatsoever. But I suppose that it's not like they don't mention environmentalism at all, because actually it was only a year or two ago that Maria was hinging a whole election campaign on that.
Yeah. I think Corrie's very risk adverse, and they only want to engage in a controversial topic if they know that there is a right side to it. And there are some things, unfortunately, that there are no right answers to, and they are complicated, and I think a soap could do it, but I don't think that any of the soaps are brave enough to, and I'm not even going to tell you what the topics are, because they're that controversial, and I don't blame them at all. I would be the same if I was in charge. I would not touch any of these things with a barge pole. But yeah, without going into too much, too much specifics. I think environmental activism is one of them. Because there are lots of people who are incredibly vitriolic about Just Stop Oil and the like. But a lot of them also agree with the general principle that they're arguing about.
Yeah.
So that really is a dilemma that I think Coronation Street's nailed its colours to the mast about environmental stuff. I think in this country, I don't feel like it's as political as it is in other countries. I feel as though the environment has got a bit more of a loaded topic in other places. I don't know why they shied away so much from this. You've also put down some idea about immigration.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking, if I thinking right back to the very early days of Coronation Street, and you had the character of Ivan Chevesky, and he was, he didn't live on the street for a long time, and he was going back and forth from, I can't remember where he went off with Linda, but he was an early example of a non-British citizen character, and we don't really have anybody like that these days, do we? Yet immigration arguably is even more of an issue and a big hot topic. And they had Alina recently.
Well, why didn't they have? They could have. We've got blimmin' Daniel sacrificing his child and his fiance and their comfort and safety so that he can house immigrants in his house, which presumably are Ukrainian. They haven't said that they're Ukrainian.
I can't remember.
That is heavily implied, given the fact that when the war began, British citizens were encouraged to sign up to give a room or even their whole house to immigrants who would come over. Well, refugees. They're not really immigrants, are they? Refugees from the war. And it looks like that's what Daniel's done. Why don't we know who these people are?
Because they live a long way away, basically.
I know, but wouldn't that be interesting?
I would find it really interesting to have a full-time immigrant character and seeing what prejudices they might face.
Yeah,
how difficult it would be for them to integrate into the country in
a
really
similar
way to Ivan.
When she was here, she was a Polish worker who came.
I thought you were talking about Irish Vicky. Then you were talking about Polish Vicky.
Polish Vicky.
Yeah, she stayed in the show for a good few years.
She was
actually.
good, and she actually represented issues surrounding the fact that she was an immigrant.
So maybe they have done that one again.
Not recently.
No.
Not within. I would say. Not within the podcast history.
No, I don't think so.
And Alina, she was a victim, wasn't she? She didn't. I don't remember whether she chose to come here or if she was tricked. I can't remember now. But she didn't represent somebody who's come here and said, I want to go to the UK because.
No, she wasn't an asylum seeker.
No. I'm not talking about asylum. I'm not talking about refugees. I'm talking about somebody who says, I have come to this country. There's no controversy about how I came here. It is a perfectly legal process that I engaged in, and now I have come here to make my life better, and I have criticisms and I have praises, and I can give a different lens. I'm going to say we've mentioned this before on the podcast because there was that very weird story about China and trying to sell Coronation Street to Chinese people.
What's that? I don't remember that.
I have a memory that there was some kind of thing that we came across. We were like, that is very strange. Why not have, unless we said this before, not that long ago, a Chinese student. We had Sheen, that was a while ago.
Yeah, I can't remember which soap. They have just put a Chinese family.
I think that's what we said. I think we spoke about it. There are many Chinese students in the UK. Why not have if you honestly you want to engage Chinese people, there's like a lot of them. That is an untapped market for Coronation Street. Imagine being able to export Coronation Street to over 1 billion people. I don't know how much they'd have to censor. Get those viewing
figures up again.
I don't know how much they'd have to censor for Chinese audiences. but let's not pretend that every single person, everyone on Coronation Street has an English accent because they were born in England, right? There are lots of people who are part of our communities that are from different countries. Let's have different voices.
Yeah.
Let's have different perspectives. Let's have somebody. I'd love a Chinese student so much. I would love that.
Yeah. Going back to the topic of old stories revisited again, I was thinking of how they just had Number 7 Coronation Street just collapse that
Love
one
it.
time in the 60s.
And they just went...
Do houses just collapse anymore? I don't really know. I mean, we had the factory collapse, but...
Depends on whether they're a pub that needs to be redeveloped into something and then just suddenly catches on fire and gets demolished all in a day.
I don't think they'd ever do it, but they could. Just literally having one of the houses collapse.
Well, they tried it with a sinkhole and it didn't go.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe that's...
I think if they tried that now, then we're like, oh, sinkhole again. Where's Leo when you need him?
I suppose it's easier to make
In
a
the
house
bin.
collapse when it was just the front that they had to get rid of.
Well, also...
And now it is there's actually a building there that they would have
Wasn't-
to properly take the wrecking ball to.
Wasn't it a budget problem, though?
Yeah.
It was like, we literally don't have the money for this house. Just get rid of it.
Yeah,
Split
we
up.
don't. We haven't got enough characters to fill all the houses
They do
on this
not have
street.
that
They do
problem.
not have that problem.
They
anymore.
need more... There's a housing crisis in Weatherfield.
I'd be interested in seeing that though.
Right, so tell me some of the things that you think we could revisit this year. In 2023, looking back on the long and storied history of Coronation Street over 61 years.
Like I said, really, really difficult to come up with
You've
some decent
written a list.
ideas for this.
I'm trying to get you to read your list out.
One of the first things I thought of as an early Coronation Street story that maybe they haven't done anything similar like this to recently is the poison pen letter.
No, I'm going to point out that there were nasty anonymous comments online.
Yeah, that is that the closest
That's the
thing
modern
these
equivalent.
days? That's the modern equivalent.
That was
So,
Maria, and also
I think
Gemma. Didn't Gemma get a load of
I think that
hate?
I think that Beth did as well
Yeah.
one time, and
Yeah.
Craig defended her.
Yeah.
But a poison
Yeah, that's
pen
right.
is something that's a little bit more personal, and it had to have come from a neighbour. Well, Ina, when Elsie was getting her poison pen letters, she thought it was Ina that was giving them to her, but actually it was somebody else that lived nearby.
Some
It
boring
wasn't a
person.
main character, but I don't know. Maybe somebody in some way getting a message that you knew was from a local resident
No,
somehow.
that happened with Maria and that horrible.
Okay, been
Cancer.
done. Been done.
But well done, Corrie, for bringing that back.
Okay. What about mixed religion marriage? So when Harry Hewitt and Concepta Riley
That was quite the
got
to-do.
married in 1961, and he was a Protestant and she was a Catholic, that was definitely a to do both on and off screen, or I think more off screen to be honest.
Yeah, on screen they did address it, but it wasn't like. Well, there was a bit where Concepta was like, I don't know if this is going to work, actually.
Yeah. Maybe is that less relevant these days? I mean, for some, there are definitely, although the world is becoming more secular in this country, definitely is. There are definitely some people who are still do have a very strong faith, and maybe that might cause issues. I mean, I guess we can look at, say, Billy versus Paul now, which is faith versus no faith. But do we?
You're not gonna. The thing is, they wouldn't do this. I'd love them to, but the only way they could do it, they couldn't do different sects of Christianity because nobody would find that. Even
a Methodist and a Baptist.
people wouldn't even understand what you were trying to say.
Yeah,
they wouldn't get it. But you would have to have something like Christian and Muslim. First of all, you'd need characters that acknowledge they were religious. We had it a little bit with Rana and Zidane, where she was obviously a lot more secular than he was, and he didn't like that. And she had to go to the imam and talk to them, and she obviously was quite uncomfortable with that. You'd have to have a Muslim and a Christian. It wouldn't feel right to have the Muslim convert to Christianity, because that would feel a bit like saying Muslims should all convert to Christianity. But if you had it the other way around, it would just open up Muslims for criticism, because everyone would be up in arms about the idea that a Christian.
But there wouldn't necessarily need to
converting.
be a conversion necessary, because I'm sure
that's
that there's
true.
plenty of marriages where people, as the wife is Christian,
That's true,
the
yeah,
husband is
mixed
Sikh or
religion
whatever, and maybe that could be interesting, and it was absolutely fine for Harry and Concepta at the end of the day, and people might
Not
say,
really.
well, apart from the fact you
One of
got
them
splattered,
died.
people might say, well, Catholic and Protestant are both much of a muchness, more so than other ones, but not necessarily.
That doesn't work out, does it?
Yeah,
I like that idea.
Any others that you think of that you could have a look at my list if you like?
I like this thing you've got about Dennis when he launched Walter Potts, and they had Brett Falcon, who was actually played by Chris Sanford.
Yeah, so Walter Potts was the character name, and Brett Falcon was his stage name, and it was this singing sensation because Dennis Tanner was a talent scout for a while. And you're right, he was played by this actual singer called Chris Sanford, who I just discovered the other day is still alive, and he's got a website.
As are we all.
And he releases books about fly fishing.
Nice one.
So, potential
Calm down,
future
J.R.
interview.
Hartley.
Potential future interviewee. Though. Anyone want to know what it was like being Walter Potts in the 1960s? But do you reckon that we could have launching an actual real life singer? I mean, Coronation Street wants to woo the youth audience, don't they?
I'm going to say that they tried this in a very 2020s way, and they botched it, which annoyed me. And it might have been early in the 2020s with Bethany and Groomer. What's his name? Nathan. He tried to make her a YouTube star. Do you not remember this?
Yes, I do. Doing her how to braid your hair. It was
so brief, but that would actually be quite interesting. Yes, having. I mean, is kind of Ryan's doing that to himself, isn't he? He wanted to be an influential DJ online, and then he gave up because of lockdown and everything. Well, that was why he started it in the first place, to be clear. Yeah, I like the idea. I don't think that anybody with any sense in their head would think working class northern person with no contacts in the industry can launch an act. Without talent myself, I can latch onto somebody and I can nurture them into. That's not how the industry works anymore. You can be somebody with no contacts and have talent and become famous, but you can't become a manager.
No, but I mean, talents. The modern equivalent to talent scouting is your Britain's Got Talent X Factor, isn't it? And you had Chris Sanford, who was a singer, and through Coronation Street, he launched a single that got to number 19 in the charts or something. And that was, the singer, the person who played Walter Potts / Brett Falcon, launched a single and he had screaming fangirls at the Granada studios waiting for him.
I can't imagine that.
So I guess the equivalent of that these days would be Coronation Street getting an up-and-coming singer, casting him, whilst at the same time putting him forward onto X Factor and saying, look, fellow ITV show, can we make sure that this one gets to the judges' houses, please?
That would be such a mind...
Would he then get all the fans that come with that kind of show? And I don't think that gets quite the same level of hype these days as it did maybe 20 years ago. How
meta would that be? It would be like when Gemma and everybody went on This Morning.
Yeah. Well, they did do a thing once when they had Andy Wyman turn up at Britain's Got Talent or the X Factor one time, didn't they? In the role of Kirk, saying, "I'm going to sing you a song." That could be funny, but I don't see it necessarily happening. But it's an idea.
Well, I mean, the equivalent isn't singing anymore. Celebrity is morphed into such a nebulous concept now that it's become accessible to anybody. You can be a celebrity for doing DIY in your house. You can be a celebrity for recording yourself cooking. Why not have somebody doing like TikTok or something?
Yeah. Do they just have, as part of this Ryan Connor story, get Brian Prescott to actually upload Ryan Prescott upload pictures to his abs a couple of times a week? I wonder how many followers if they set up a Ryan Connor.
Yeah, I have said this
in real life account.
I've said that characters should have in-universe social media.
They had one for Norris, didn't they, once? But maybe that'd be, maybe have one for Ryan, one for Daisy.
I think the thing is, I think the thing is that a lot of actors, even if they really crave celebrity and fame, very quickly realise that it can be incredibly intrusive and unpleasant, and you would have to have somebody who, and you'd also, I don't know that you would be able to adequately say you've protected this person
No.
by throwing them to the wolves of the internet and saying right, take your top off, let's take a picture of you and put you on the internet and don't read the comments.
Yeah, but would it be worth it to get that younger audience that
It's
Coronation Street so craves?
I mean, if you look back to how problematic celebrity culture was in the early 2000s, and that was when social media was very, very young, if it existed at all, you really could have got away with it then. When we had Torso of the Week and Red Circles, and I don't even know if they do that anymore, but
I don't think so.
Britney Spears, instead of everyone saying how sad and tragic she's going through something, I was like, look at her head, she shaved her hair off, here's a photo of her crying in the hairdress. That would have been prime time to have taken advantage of this, but we know better now, and perhaps
I do
not
wonder,
appropriate.
what, if any, effect that particular story had on the viewing figures of Coronation Street back in the day.
Which story?
The Walter Potts story. If he gained all these extra young teenage fans, did they tune into Coronation Street when they wouldn't normally have done? I mean, he was a one-hit wonder anyway at the end of the day, so it wasn't long lasting. But I could kind of think of that. Another one, another nice easy one that I'd love for them to do. In the 70s, we had Bet winning the Spot the Ball competition in the paper and getting a trip for all the Corrie ladies to go out to Mallorca. And I just want them to do that storyline again, because I'd love for Corrie to film abroad again.
Yeah, we want them to go to Ireland or Northern Ireland.
Oh yeah, so that because we've still never been to Ireland, Gemma and I, and we were thinking if Coronation Street would film there, maybe we could go across and do a little Corrie tour of Ireland.
No, the main sticking point is if Coronation Street films in Ireland or Northern Ireland, not only can we get a plane from Southampton because they stop at Dublin or Belfast and then fly to Manchester, not only could we get a plane, but we could also put it on expenses because we would be doing a tour of the Coronation Street filming.
No, honestly, it's been so long since Corrie has filmed abroad, it almost feels like it's okay to say, just putting them abroad is revisiting an old story. But actually, that one where they went to Mallorca for 2 days, Mavis gets a boyfriend, or Bet does, but then it turns out that he's not interested in her in the end. I would absolutely love just to have, with the current batch of Corrie ladies or men, send them abroad just for a jolly good time.
When was the last time they filmed in a different country?
I can't remember now. I think it might have been that one where Steve and Eileen went to. That island. Yeah, it's not.
I mean, they've obviously been to places. They went to South Africa most recently for the DVD spin-off, but that's a different. I think that's a different expense account, so it doesn't count.
So there's one I'd like. I also thought that you remember how Ken married Janet Reid, which was just a surprise to viewers and residents of the street.
And Janet.
Yeah, and Janet. Yeah, he went up to Scotland and he came back married. Could that be revisited? They kind of did it with David and Kylie when he came back and he was engaged to someone. Although this someone, it was a character that we knew. That wasn't the first we'd seen of Kylie, was it? So maybe they did do it there.
This is all hard because it seems like you take any story and you can argue they've done it.
They've done it since.
Because you've also put Long Lost Child, like Bet, and when she found the child that was the soldier and then he died.
Yeah.
But, we had that with Nick and Sam.
Yes, we did have that with Nick and Sam. You're absolutely right. It is so difficult.
Oh, I know.
Have we had it with a woman before? A character who has given birth in the past, but as yet we don't know, or we later found out that she was a mum.
The only person I can think of is Jenny, but that wasn't really the case.
No, yeah, that's slightly different, isn't it?
If
we had now,
like Daisy. Suddenly turns out Daisy's got a secret baby.
Yeah, or maybe somebody who's a bit older, a bit more mature, like I was going to say Fizz, but it couldn't be Fizz because we've seen her grow up.
You don't like her, and she's funny.
Mary.
Mary.
Oh yeah, Mary's secret
Jude.
son. Damn, they've done that. They've literally.
They've done it. They've done it. They've done it all. They've done it all. I know. I've got an idea. What if the Rovers gets into financial trouble and they have to stage a robbery? What if there's trouble at the factory and you can't get the order out on time?
No.
What if the Rovers is on the brink of bankruptcy?
Right. Okay. I really enjoyed. This is another one I thought of. The love triangle-ish. And I know that love triangles have been done to death, but the one with Mavis and Derek and Victor Pendlebury, which wasn't a saucy, racy love triangle.
Yeah, we don't want saucy, racy ones.
It was more of a comedic one where you had these two... this woman who was being pursued by these two men, both of whom treated her fairly badly, but it was kind of funny, and one we sided with more than the other. Could we do that? Would that work with maybe Mary and Brian? And how, because Brian's obviously going after Mary at the moment, isn't he? Not that she realises this yet. Could there be another suitor come on the scene, a Victor Pendlebury type, who is actually a bit more of a charmer, and Mary starts to fall for him in a way, but obviously as the viewers we want Brian to win, and he is able to get Mary on his side, but then every now and then, this is the thing with Victor Pendlebury back through the 80s, like years would go by and then he'd show up on the scene again, and it's like, dastardly cad has returned again to sweep Mavis away. That could possibly work. I'm really struggling for ideas. This is a great question, but I can't think of many.
You've written down a cult story.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that was not from the 60s and 70s, but we had the cult in the late 90s with the Etheric Foundation and the cult of Nirab.
How long
Could we
does
revisit
it need
that?
to be? How long does it need to be, Mark?
No, this is David, this guy.
Oh, sorry, David, yeah.
Storylines from the past. So I think we can go back to the 90s if we want to and revisit
Okay.
a cult storyline. Personally, I don't think we need a new cult. I'd be quite interested to
me
see
too.
what's actually happening with the cult of Nirab.
We were so
Bring back Joe Froggatt's character, Zoe Tattersall.
I
Bring
think
back...
she's probably a bit too grand to come
no,
back.
she'd come back.
Do you
She'd come
reckon?
back. Bring back, what's his face, who's Game of Thrones man.
Game of Thronesman.
I can't remember what his name is now, that played the leader.
Yeah.
I'd love them
Forgotten
to
his name.
revisit that.
We thought that we were going there with the Bond to Kidnap Summer.
Mike and Esther.
I would loved that to have turned
That would
out.
have been, we did. We thought that could have been a cult.
Honestly,
didn't we?
if I was on Corrie and I'd listened to our show and heard that, I would have been kicking myself, going, "Why didn't we make them cult people?" That would have been great.
Cults aren't really a big talked about thing at the moment.
They're not a big talk about thing, but I'm going to tell you they still exist.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But when people kind of started to realise what was going on with Scientology, suddenly everyone was thinking, "Well, cults this, cults that." But it's
you can't. I don't think we're legally allowed to link those two things together. I'm not getting in trouble.
So I was wondering, if we think about which older stories can we visit, and now they might look different with different technology. You had another classic story from the 80s was when Jack and Vera both signed up for that dating agency, and that led to the Vince Sinclair, Carol Monroe. What would that look like? We haven't
actually had, which would be so easy to do, a couple break up or they're cheating on each other and they both end up on Tinder or...
That's the equivalent, isn't it?
It really is.
But it was so funny then with Jack and Vera doing it, and I don't know whether that would just be like, "Oh, I can't believe that they're doing that," and he wouldn't be able to find the comedy.
I'm trying
so
to
you'd
think
have to
of a couple, like the closest ones I can think of would have been Michelle and Steve, or maybe Steve and Tracy, but not recently. When Liz was still about, I can totally see them both ending up on what would be the Weatherfield equivalent of Tinder.
I'm sure there is one. I don't know.
Yeah, probably. But yeah, I can imagine them both signing up behind each other's backs.
The thing with Jack and Vera, though, is we were supposed to believe, they've been together for so long, they've grown sick of each other, and they're looking for something new. But on Coronation Street these days, couples don't stay together for more than a couple of years.
Well,
so they don't have time to grow weary of each other and start to want to look elsewhere.
But also, in the day, it was funny when Jack and Vera is like, "Ha ha, he just wants a bit of slap and tickle with another lady."
Yeah.
Whereas now it would be, it's totally without her consent. If you don't want, you can't cheat behind her back. He's a dog.
Well, yeah, Jack used to go, after Dulcie Froggatt on his window round, didn't he? And you're right, it was very much like...
It's like, well, who could stand her anyway? Whereas these days you wouldn't have that attitude.
No, but I suppose you're right. Having characters both signing up to a dating website, they could do it. Maybe Sally's feeling a little bit.
No.
She doesn't have. Tim's not giving her all the attention. Maybe it's related to because he had his problems in the bedroom last year, didn't he? Maybe Sally then signs up to one of these websites just because she wants to get some compliments. She wants to feel attractive again.
Maybe it's a website for friends and lovers.
She
signs up for friends, but she clicks the wrong button.
That could work. Do you remember there was the story a few years ago when Maria signed up to one of those and she said, "I'd just like to Netflix and chill."
Oh yeah.
And then she didn't realise what that actually meant. Nor did I at the time. I had to learn that at the same time. But yeah, I'm thinking if Sally signs up to a dating website because she feels that Tim isn't giving her quite enough attention, accidentally clicks an option to make it look like she wants relationship, and then does she find Tim on there? But why would Tim have been on there? Is it also to try... I'm feeling that there's the germination of an idea there.
It could work. Maybe Tim is looking for Craig. Maybe Craig's come to him and said, I need a lady friend, and Tim's like, I know how to read and write now. I can help you set up your account. And then he types in, I wonder who's round here that you might be able to get off with. Yeah. And then he does it geographically and he says, oh, there's a MILF here for you. Hang on a minute, she looks familiar.
Yeah, could be funny. But probably if they did that, people would say, oh, you're just copying the Jack and Vera story. But like as we kind of seem to have discovered here, there has been an awful lot of copying old stories.
There's nothing new under the sun, Michael.
I'd like to also see and something that worked really well, but they'd have to invest in this in a long time. The Mike and Ken rivalry storyline was epic.
We were very keen that this would be rekindled with the return of Adam and Daniel. We were sure.
You're right.
When they first came back, we were saying, brilliant. They're rekindling this for the new era. Can't believe how brilliant. What a great idea this is. The reincarnation of Mike and Ken's prodigy coming on the show and rehashing the great rivalry, and then it just went to nothing because they didn't hear us or care what we thought.
I mean, again, thinking about revisiting old stories, there have been ways that Daniel's life has mirrored Ken's in some, like the tragic young wife lost and left
raising
holding
a
the baby and things like that. But yeah, maybe not so much the rivalry.
Being arrogant, overestimating how smart you are, etc.
The closest rivalry we talked about earlier was Carla and Tracy, although that wasn't necessarily... I don't even remember how that started, but I don't think it was born out of the love triangle, which...
No.
That's the same way Ken's and Mike did. So maybe we need to have a story where there is two guys fighting over a woman, but they need to invest in it, and it needs to be long lasting.
I'm going to point out to you that it wasn't just two men after the same woman. It was two men who were ideologically opposed
you're right,
to each other, who couldn't disrespect each other's entire life philosophies more, or have come to the situation in life at more of a different way than both these men. Ken and Mike were a perfect fictional face-off between two different ways of life, and they're the closest thing you can get to that, really, I'm thinking, is actually Daisy and Daniel, because she is very superficial and consumerist, and he is very intellectual and he dislikes frivolity, and these two characters have made a relationship out of each other rather than a rivalry. But if they were brother and sister, that would be a really fascinating
if this ends up working round to be Ryan and Daisy having an affair, are Ryan and Daniel different enough for that to work as a rivalry? Not really.
Well, I mean, no.
It is intelligence I'm sure that Daniel looks down on Ryan in some ways.
I don't think Ryan feels as though he is is deeply invested in
anything.
the reason why he does anything.
No.
You know, Mike hated how much Ken looked down on him, and Ken hated everything Mike stood for. And the fact that he was successful only made it worse. There's nothing like Ken versus Mike. Deirdre was basically incidental to the whole thing. She's the reason that they kept clashing heads. If she didn't exist as a character, they would not have had much to do with each other, apart from Susan, obviously. But the fact that they were fighting over her made it all the more exciting. Coronation Street could do quite well to try to look and see if they can create a rivalry.
You have to have characters that are very, very, very
You
principled.
have to have established characters, and you have to have characters who have deliberately decided to live their life for a certain person.
And as we were saying right at the very beginning of this podcast, there's so many characters now that will do whatever the writers tell them to as the plot bends them. That sort of character is harder to come by. There's definitely
still a possibility that they could develop this with Adam and Daniel.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because
I think that'd be a great route to go down for them.
Adam it feels to me, and there's a bit of a likeness. Maybe I'm remembering people's faces wrong. There's a slight bit of likeness between him and young Anakin Skywalker. It's the glaring and the pacing. But if Adam, from his tattered relationship and unborn child, lost opportunity, if he turns bitter and anti-family and leans more into dispassionate
ruthless business
side. Yeah, if he sort of starts caring more about the law firm and churning money out and getting people in, I don't care what the case is, I don't care who's right or wrong, I want the money. And then you have Daniel maybe leaning more into raising Bertie, marrying Daisy, being a family man. Those two, I don't know what would cause them to argue.
Not, Adam as his way with Daisy, because she's certainly not as keen on Daniel as she used to be. So maybe Adam's able to tempt her away, and that could be the catalyst for it. Again, people say, well, it's just the same story, but come on, it's 40 years on.
Honestly, there's so much potential for Adam versus Daniel, not just because of the family history and background. Because honestly, I think most people watching it now really don't know or remember or care about Ken and Mike anymore, which is sad to say, but it's true. And also, Daniel and Adam are both good-looking young men.
Yeah.
There are plenty of ladies on Twitter. You could fire them up, and I'd hate using fandoms like this. I think it's really dangerous.
Who's the hottest?
But you could fire those girls up to tweet endlessly about who's better at Daniel and Adam. I wouldn't like to be the actors involved in this, and I don't necessarily condone this, but if I was trying to make my show popular on the internet, this is what I'd do. I'd have two hot men having a fight. I'd have them take their clothes off and wrestle in the gutters and recreate old Gail and Eileen, except a bit more sexy.
Well, they didn't try to sex up Ken and Mike's fight. He just bopped him on the nose in the factory one time.
No, they didn't.
Again in the pub.
They didn't, but we're in a different era. This was supposed to be what would you do in 2023.
Well, there we go.
And here's my long-term projection, my plan. I'm going to do some pie charts, if you like. But, I mean, this kind of reminds me of a little bit of, like, the rabbit hole we went down with Ali and Ryan as sexy brothers.
Well, I mean, maybe we came up with a couple of ideas for you there, David.
David. If you're secretly in the production suite, I don't think we helped you.
As I say, it's really difficult because they've just done it so many times, and some of it's recently. I mean, you had early on in Coronation Street, they had a couple of stories which touched on suicide. You had Christine Hardman on the roof. You had Sheila Birtles with her pills, and then and it hasn't been touched on loads in Coronation Street, obviously, but you had Ken trying to take his own life in the early 90s, and then obviously Aidan recently. That's been done before. Even things like, Myra Booth's obsession with catalogue buying. Well, you've had that with Kathy and Gina recently.
Yeah,
have
Gina.
been obsessed with that kind of thing. Unexploded World War II bombs. Yeah, they had that in the Peacock's garden. Again, maybe 15, 20 years ago. There's just been so much that has already been done. Maybe that's why Corrie, some might say, is struggling to come up with ideas sometimes now. It's like, oh, we've already been over our back catalogue once. We can't do it again, can we?
I say go for it.
No, I think Corrie has still got lots of good ideas.
I think they're doing really, I think it's hard, and I think the other thing to point
So
out
difficult.
too is that you're talking about, you know, I don't know how many years, 30 years with 2 episodes a week, I don't know. And then now we've got, 6 episodes a week. Of course we're going through everything because we're going through more episodes.
Such a pain. I can't remember why I was looking this up the other day, but I saw that episode 3000 of Coronation Street was the one where was around where Rita was in Blackpool with Alan Bradley. And they had
3,000? Are you kidding me?
Yeah. And we're now 11,000.
Yeah.
Think we've seen quite a large percentage of Coronation Street now, and it feels like there was so much crammed into those 3,000 episodes.
You could have just watched 10 years of Coronation Street and seen more than a sixth of Coronation Street.
Yeah. So it was less time to fill there, wasn't there?
Maybe they should go back to 2 episodes a week and then see how everyone bloody likes that.
I want them to have another story where they end up with sea lions in a bath somehow.
Why not? I'm going to go all for it, and maybe it can be linked to climate change.
Oh yeah. I think we're done. If anyone else has got any ideas for this, I'd absolutely love to hear it. If you can think of any interesting old stories that Coronation Street hasn't revisited or painted over in a different way.
Redoing what they did, which I still stand by saying was a fantastic piece of telly, when Ken's mum died. And we don't know what happened the whole episode, and it slowly becomes apparent to us that she's been killed.
Yeah.
And we spend all episode following Ken and
what's happened,
Frank desperately searching, cutting away to the police officers going, there's a scarf with blood on it, and it's got Mrs. Barlow written on. Who could this belong to?
Yeah. Oh, but I'm sure.
I mean, you complain about experimental. And I do as well, experimental storytelling, as far as cameras, angles and things. But that really, I can't imagine Coronation Street doing that now. And I think they were a bit more experimental in the early days. But then they didn't have a formula. They weren't
spoiler culture then.
They weren't. Yeah, but they weren't running to a formula. They kind of could do what they wanted. They created the formula.
Yeah. Anyway, that's enough of that. That's quite a long listener question segment.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
They're really good, thought-provoking questions, and even though we've been talking for nearly 2 hours, it still feels like we have barely brushed the surface of truly answering them.
Yeah, so send us some messages
Over
yourself.
to you.
What do you think?
Give
us some of your ideas. Any of the characters that have changed loads over the year, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
Let's do some more betters. I feel like it's so easy to go down the negative, isn't it?
Yeah.
There have been lots of characters that have changed for the better. But any others that really stand out to you, and if you can think of any old Coronation Street stories that you think need a new lick of paint for 2023, I kind of was thinking about the first 20 years, but maybe 30, but is there anything from the early 2000s that we could maybe revisit again, something from the 90s without it feeling too much, or they've only just done this recently? Maybe that's just me and I'm still thinking, no, it wasn't long ago since we had the 90s, was it? I'm not old.
No, it was just yesterday.
Anyway, so that's it.